Yetis! Maybe that's a sound they make. Hi, hello, hey. My name is Steph Chef, and this is Crochet and Creepy, where I tell you something creepy and make you something cute. So today, while I regale you with tales of the creepy, I'm gonna be just working on a little stash buster blanket, starting with this piece of yarn. Actually, come back after I've counted. Okay, folks, grab a beverage and gather around because this one is a doozy. It's one of those cases where for every argument, there's a counter-argument for the many, many theories. Today, I'm going to tell you about the Dyatlov Pass incident. And right here, I'm just going to apologize in advance for my American accent. I do not speak Russian, but I'm going to try my very best to pronounce all of the Russian names correctly. Probably not going to get them all right, but I'm going to try. So back in early 1959, a group of 9 university students and one older dude went on a really dangerous trek through the Russian mountains. Sadly, none of them survived. The end. Okay, bye. So this group of 10 hikers were all very experienced, and they had planned this rugged hike over unforgiving terrain up in the Russian mountains, with the goal of getting their grade 3 certification, with grade 3 being the highest level that you could obtain at the time. And the leader of the group was a man named Igor Dyatlov. Quick little fun fact, the Dyatlov Pass is actually named for him. Before this incident, it was just another little random bit of lonely mountain. At the time, Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. The other 9 hikers who joined him were Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, Yuri Krivonoshenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Yuri Yudin. That was a lot of letters. So the 9 university students knew each other beforehand, and the one stranger to the group was Semyon. He was 38 years old, so a bit older than the rest of them, and also a last-minute addition to the group. So on January 25th, 1959, this group of 10 arrived in a place called Visay, and that's kind of where they began the real hard part of their trek. A couple of days into it, though, Yuri Yudin started to feel bad. He kind of got aches and pains in his joints, which was normal for him. So he decided to turn around and go back because he knew that if he continued on, he was just going to become a burden to everybody else. So as he's leaving, the group leader, Igor Dyatlov, tells him that he should expect to hear from the group on February 12th. So with that, the group of 9 continues on their way and Yuri Yudin returns, and that was on January the 28th. So the next few days go by without any major incidents happening. The group keeps on with their journey, they keep journaling and taking pictures. I forgot to mention that they each had their own individual journals along with a group journal that they would write in, and they had a few cameras along with them. So there are actually quite a few pictures that you can find of the group, which is pretty neat and kind of haunting. So February the 12th rolls around and nobody hears anything from the hikers. On that day, though, they weren't really worried about it because it had been a long, arduous hike that they'd planned, and it would have been pretty ordinary for them to arrive a couple of days later than they'd intended. So fast forward to the 20th of February, and still nobody has heard anything from the hikers. At that point, they were pretty worried, and the families of the hikers called for a search and rescue party. It was a pretty extensive search team with helicopters and dogs, the whole 9 yards. But for the first week or so, they didn't see any sign of them. Finally, on the 26th of February, the search team comes across the campers' abandoned tent in the snow. So when they found the tent, they noticed that it had holes cut through the side of it, and that the tent poles and some skis were still standing straight up, but the middle of it was kind of sunk down a little under the weight of some new snow that had fallen. When they looked inside the tent, they saw that most of the hikers' things were still there, including a lot of their big jackets, their shoes, and things were stacked pretty neatly on the inside of it still, so it didn't look like anything crazy had happened. So upon further inspection, they discovered that those gashes in the tent had actually been made from the inside rather than the outside. So it wasn't something outside of the tent trying to get in at them, although what would even be outside in the freezing cold at that time? Yetis. but actually it was the campers slicing their way out of the tent. So the searchers had stumbled on something pretty weird there. They'd found the hikers' abandoned, slashed-up tent, but no sign of the hikers, and most of their stuff was still inside that tent. So they said they found 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent and heading to the forest. It looked like the footprints were headed in calmly, so not erratically or panicking, and they said that they could tell that some of the campers were wearing only socks or that they were barefoot. So here I wondered, how did those footprints survive for almost a month, and how were they able to tell that they were barefoot or only wearing socks? So what I learned after digging into it was that apparently the way the wind and snow worked up there was when the hikers made their footprints into the snow, they compressed that bit of snow down, and the wind then blew the loose snow away from that print. So what it left was a raised, compressed footprint instead of being an indentation into the snow, which is pretty neat. And they were able to tell that they were barefoot because they could actually see the indentations of their toes in the print. Oh dear, I've been doing the wrong stitch. Take it out, frog it, frog it. So the next day, they found the first 2 bodies, and those were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, who I am now going to call Yuri D and Yuri K. So the bodies ended up being found kind of in 3 different groups. So for my own sanity, I'm going to tell you about them like as they were found in those 3 groups. And the first group was those 2, Yuri D and Yuri K. And they were actually found under a cedar tree. So where the tent was just basically on the slope of the mountain, and about a mile away from the tent, there was some tree cover, so kind of like a little forest. And that is where Yuri D and Yuri K were, underneath one of those big cedar trees. So next to them, they found the remains of a campfire. And when I read that, I was like, how did they even start a campfire out there? It was dark, it was windy, it was cold, everything was snowy and wet. But when I read on, I saw that a couple of the hikers had been found with some matches in their pockets, so I guess that's that on that. So Yuri D was only wearing an undershirt, some shorts, a mismatched pair of socks, and he had no shoes on, which made absolutely no sense. The sock on his left foot was burned, and so was some of the hair on the right side of his head. He had some gray foam coming out of his mouth, which could have been caused by a big pressure on his chest, which might have happened from falling out of a tree. His cause of death was listed as hypothermia. As for Yuri K, he was only wearing an undershirt, a long sleeve shirt, long underpants, and a sock on his left foot. His cause of death was also listed as hypothermia. So next, the investigators checked out the tree that they were lying underneath, and they noticed that all of the branches from the ground up to about 5 meters, which is around 15-ish feet, were all broken off. So it looked like they had probably tried to climb the tree, maybe either to escape something or to try and get a look and see where their tent was. So the next 3 bodies that were found between that tree and the tent. It looked like the 3 of them had tried to head back to the tent, but unfortunately did not make it. Those 3 were Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group, Zenaida Komogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. So from here on, I figured it would get kind of hard to follow with me just listing out all of their clothing items and their injuries that they had. Also hard for me to memorize. I am just one human, not a Yeti. So I'm going to list out their clothing over here and their injuries over here. And while future me does that, I'm going to tell you a little fun fact about each of the hikers. So Igor Dyatlov, other than being the leader of the group, he was actually a pretty talented engineer. He had actually invented a small stove that they brought along, and that was what they used to keep warm and cook their food on. And as you can see, he didn't really have anything crazy going on in the injuries department, and his cause of death was also listed as hypothermia. So Zenaida, who went by Zena, she was really well liked and outgoing. She also seemed like a badass. On one of her previous hikes, she was bitten by a viper, but she carried on and even didn't want anyone to carry her backpack for her, which I just cannot fathom. I think if I was bitten by a viper, I would probably let somebody carry my heavy backpack. Her cause of death was also listed as hypothermia. So next was Rustem Slobodin. He was actually found a few days after they had found the other 4 hikers, but he was still one of the 3 bodies they found between the cedar tree and the tent. So Rustem was a long-distance runner, and he also liked to play the mandolin. His cause of death was also listed as hypothermia. Okay, so that is 5 hikers found and 4 to go. But the 4 remaining hikers wouldn't be found until 2 months later on May 5th, after some of the snow had already started to melt. So those last 4 were all found very close to each other, and they were deeper into the woods, and they were found in a ravine. It looked like they had tried to build themselves some sort of makeshift shelter because investigators found stacked branches and pieces of clothing that they could have used to protect themselves from the snow. However, they weren't found in that little shelter, they were found in the ravine in the water. So these 4 were relatively more dressed than the other hikers that they found, but since they were found 2 months later and in the water, the decomposition of their bodies was a lot further along. So first is Lyudmila, who went by Lyuda. She was the youngest of the group, but still very tough. She loved to sing and take photographs, and on one of her previous hikes, she was accidentally shot in the leg, but she managed to carry through just fine. These women were seriously tough. Lyuda's cause of death was listed as severe chest trauma and internal bleeding. So Semyon, the older guy, was a little bit more mysterious. He had worked as a sports instructor and he had tattoos. His cause of death was listed as severe chest trauma. And when they found him, he actually had a camera around his neck, but the camera was water damaged, so they weren't actually able to recover any photographs from it. Sorry folks, no Yeti photos. Next we have Alexander Kolevatov. While they were on the mountain, it seemed like the hikers celebrated his birthday. They gave him a tangerine as a present, and he divided it up equally between them all, which is very sweet. His cause of death was also listed as hypothermia. Last but not least was Nikolai. I could not find a whole lot of info on him, but he was a very good student and he was known to be both friendly and funny. His cause of death was listed as the injuries to his skull. So to recap here, I think future me will probably put the names of the hikers and their causes of death somewhere on the screen here. And while that is up, I will tell you that the doctor who did the autopsies of all of the bodies, and especially the last 4 with the more traumatic injuries, he said that those injuries were caused by a compelling natural force, something that he compared to a car crash. In other words, humans were not capable of making those injuries. Creepy. Phew! So now for the theories. I'm going to give them to you in what I, in my own personal unexpert opinion, consider the least likely to be the most likely. So the first theory, the least likely, in my opinion, is also my favorite theory, which, as you may have guessed, is the Yeti theory. Yetis! They were Yetis! So this theory is pretty straightforward. It's basically just that a Yeti attacked the campers at their tent, slashing open their tent and causing them to flee in a hurry so that they weren't able to get dressed or put on their shoes or anything. And this could possibly explain the traumatic injuries, because a Yeti would definitely have superhuman strength. People also attribute the missing eyes and tongue to a Yeti, because if you're going with that theory, you might as well go all the way with it. Of course, this theory is also easily debunked because the tent was slashed open from the inside, where the Yeti was not, and the group was able to walk their way over to the forest, which was about a mile away, which would have been pretty hard to do if they were being pursued by a Yeti. Pause for crochet technicality, we've reached the end of our yarn. I also think that the missing eyeballs and tongue were probably due to them having been found in the water and real animals. So theory number 2 is the KGB CIA theory. And to tell you this one, I'm going to have to tell you something that I have been keeping from you up until now. I know. Secrets. So first, 2 items of clothing that were found on the hikers tested positive for radioactivity. And second, they tested for radioactivity, which, when you think about it in itself, is a little bit odd. When most of their deaths are attributed to hypothermia, Why would they bother testing for radioactivity? Just seems kind of fishy, suspicious to me. So this theory goes that Semyon, Alexander, and Yuri K were all undercover KGB agents, and they were on a secret mission to deliver radioactive samples to CIA agents. Something went wrong, and the CIA agents killed everybody. So this theory seems to explain the radioactive clothing, the last-minute addition of Semyon to the group of college students, and maybe even some of the injuries, like Zena's big bruise or Yuri D's gray mouth foam. But I don't really think that one quite fits. For one thing, you kind of have to make a really big stretch to make everything but the radiated clothing fit in with that one. And if it really had been the CIA, why would they have let all of them then die of hypothermia? Because if it had been the CIA, you would think that they would have had guns on them, or at the very least knives. It just doesn't seem likely that they would still die of hypothermia. Plus, the ones that had the serious internal injuries, remember those injuries couldn't have been made by a human. So maybe they were CIA Yetis. Which brings us to theory number 3, the avalanche theory. So this isn't your standard avalanche where snow just kind of tumbles down the side of the mountain willy-nilly, crushing everything in its path in a wave of doom. This is a slab avalanche. Oh, have you come to join me again, little one? You're most welcome indeed. Oh. So a slab avalanche happens when a chunk of snow is balanced on top of a weaker layer of snow. When that gets disturbed, the chunk on top slides off in one big slab. So people theorize that when the hikers dug into the snow to pitch their tent, they disturbed that weak layer, and that's what then caused that chunk or the slab to slide on top of their tent. So this theory has been thoroughly researched with real live science and formulas and computer simulations. You might have even heard that Disney's Frozen was used to help figure out how it happened. An avalanche could explain why they cut themselves out of the tent in such a hurry, and it could even explain why they weren't able to go back to the tent because maybe they were afraid of triggering another one. It could possibly even explain some of those traumatic injuries. But that just doesn't quite add up to me. If it was an avalanche, why wasn't the tent completely squished instead of found still standing? And the 4 people with the worst injuries were found farthest away from the tent. They were also wearing the most clothing, seemingly having taken some from their friends who had already passed on. So how would they have been able to do that if they had been fatally injured in an avalanche? Also, when the search team arrived at the campsite, they didn't see any telltale signs of an avalanche, which, again, seems pretty fishy, suspicious to me. And now, friends, we have arrived at theory number 4, which in my personal, unexpert opinion, is the most likely theory, and that is the parachute mine theory. So at that time, Russia was still the Soviet Union, and they had apparently been testing out dropping bombs in that area since it was so remote. So it's possible that on that night, the group heard a bomb going off near them, and it terrified them enough to have them cut themselves out of their tent and flee in a hurry towards the forest, which would have offered them some sort of cover. So once they made it to the trees and got a campfire going, maybe Yuri D had climbed up to try and figure out what was going on or to try and locate their tent for them. Maybe from there he fell out of the tree, and that's the cause of the gray foam that was found in his mouth. And then after that, Yuri D and Yuri K succumbed to hypothermia, and then the rest of the group divvies up their clothes. Then they split, with Dyatlov, Zena, and Slobodin making their way back to the tent, and the other 4 head deeper into the woods, where another bomb drops, this time close enough to them to cause those internal injuries. But if that were the case, why was no evidence of a bombing found? Did the Soviets cover up everything related to the incident because they were embarrassed that they had accidentally killed 9 of their own? Doesn't really sound very likely to me. So with this one, I just think we're never gonna actually know since there were no witnesses. So those are just some of the theories about what happened that night. There are a whole bunch more, but I didn't want to take up too much of your time. So this is as far as I got with this blanket today. Not super far, but hey, progress. I would love to hear what you think about this case down below. It is definitely something that clinks around in the back of my mind, so if you have thoughts on it, I would love to hear them. Do you have a favorite theory? Is it the Yeti theory? I bet it's the Yeti theory. Let me know. But anyway, thank you for chilling with me today. I hope you had as much fun as I did. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. And if you have any thoughts or suggestions about what you want me to talk about next time, let me know. Goodbye.